I'm James, and this is Producing Fun, a podcast about making games from a product perspective. Welcome to Producing Fun. This week, my guest is Dina, Ramse, a game marketer from Finland. It would be fair to say that most of us who get into games do so because we love making them and sharing them with the world. And why not? Games bring people together, make them laugh, and make them think. In my experience, though, the sharing part is something lots of people in games are not so great at. We often get so invested in the making that we convince ourselves that actually getting it out there is an afterthought. Indeed, I think a lot of us would like to believe that if you make a better board game, the world will beat a path to your door. Of course, the experience of releasing any game into such a competitive marketplace will quickly disabuse you of that notion. The truth is that if you want a game to be more than self-expression, you need people to buy it, and people don't buy things they've never heard of. Even a pitch-perfect product needs to find a route to market. It needs the right creators to cover it. It needs to be seen on the right platforms and talked about in the right places. This is where game marketers like Dina come in. As an agent for small publishers like me, she works exactly on this problem, deploying 18 years of experience across the tabletop industry to meet the very many demands of launching a game. Most critically of all, raising funding for it on Kickstarter or other competing platforms. We took time out of our usual weekly meeting to dive into the details. Understandably, this is such an enormous brief to cover that we simply couldn't do justice to it in its entirety. But there were so many useful topics to get our teeth into, from the finer points of different social media algorithms and how to get the best out of different platforms, to selecting media creators to work with, or best practices for advertising campaigns. This discussion is sure to be of interest to anyone with a game to sell. We join just as I've asked Dina a nice, simple question. What is marketing?
It's a methodology, I think I could call it that, in the how to talk to people and ways of communication, and also the efficiency of delivering the right message at the right time.
So this is the reason I sort of couldn't help but ask such a stinker of a question is because it seems to me that what's so interesting about marketing, as opposed to maybe other parts of the process of bringing a game to market, is it does sort of feel a bit like a bit of a dark art. It's something where the ground seems to be shifting a lot of the time. So, what works one year might not work the next year. And it's very hard to predict up front what it will do. There's that famous saying about in advertising, which is half of my advertising budget is wasted, but I don't know which half. and I think there's
so true though. A/B testing from day one, half of it is absolutely crap, and you just scrap it, try new things, and obviously as the human consciousness of how market is working on them is shifting, ways to market shifts too, in order to always kind of have an upper hand on the communication that is happening to people. A few years ago, we started to see a shift between B2B and B2C marketing, where the B2B completely disappeared. And there are still some companies who thoroughly holds on to the B2B idea that, but there's such there is a difference between B2B and B2C. But there really isn't.
And when you say, that's really interesting. So when you say B2B and B2C, are we talking here about B2B in the sense of I'm selling my games to, let's say, a distributor or retailer?
Yeah.
And then B2C in terms of selling to consumers?
Yeah. And how you sell it to the retailers is basically similar to how you would sell it to the end consumers, because the person you're talking to, you're developing a relationship with them just as much as you're trying to develop a relationship with the end consumers who are picking up your game. So the shift there, we've seen the last couple of 5 years, but really during COVID, that kind of intensified to becoming newer level, because we all brought work home And everything started kind of becoming a little bit more personal because it's in our own living rooms. Like we handle business, like people get to see my living room every day and when I have my meetings. So it gets to be on a really more so the human to human contact. We are stripping away from the suits and the ties, and it's, the structure around the communications is less and less formal, which means that how you're communicating becomes less formal too.
That's interesting. That's very interesting, because in some ways I kind of wouldn't have expected that. Because if you look at particularly, I don't know, if I think about like an archetypal B2B customer in the world of board games, I kind of think of as being someone who's probably like a retailer, a store owner. And a lot of those people are quite enthusiastic anyway, right? They're quite into games. I mean, I know there are people, I'm sure if you go to really big companies like Hasbro and Asmodee to some extent, maybe not even Asmodee, there would be people in that business who are actually more classically suit types, in the sense that they do see the business more financially rather than seeing it as about, making these wonderful game things and taking them to them. So I find that quite interesting, because I can imagine that when you talk about being personal, I would have thought to some extent a lot of the B2B customers, that was already true of how they thought about things, right? Which is that they're gamers first. It's been really interesting to me seeing, as I've worked with more and more retailers, how many of them, if they're bricks and mortar retailers, they play the games that they buy and they're interested to try them just as much as their customers are.
I think it's really cool. Yeah.
Yeah, but do you think it's a bit more than that? Like that kind of, you think that environment, particularly of like people working from home, has kind of blurred the two, and that's kind of affecting people kind of psychologically? Is that?
Yeah, some of them is obviously that, but also as we're seeing like newer people who are starting companies, and like the rise of the 30 plus right now is like the new entrepreneurship that they are creating, and as they're growing their companies, they're creating a network of like-minded people, and it's kind of starting to be like, we're friends, but we're also doing business together. There's this transaction of how we're doing the relationship. And we're very aware and sensitive to what that relationship is. And it's very clearly defined. And just how that is shaping what we're doing in terms of marketing has been really fascinating for like someone like me to just watch. Because I started out with doing like marketing and sales now like 17, 18, almost 20 years ago. And just like how that has shifted. And me also obviously shifting with it and creating those personal connections with people I'm also doing business with.
Interesting. So, and you said the rise of the 30 plus, is this like an age group? Is this kind of more what you're thinking of, like, right, okay, so that's interesting, isn't it? That stuff kind of interesting, because that's something I don't think we think about that much. So most of the people that you're working with as a marketer, helping them succeed in their, for example, their Kickstarter campaigns or their board game businesses in general, are all in that kind of age cohort then? Or is like, how heavily biased is it towards that?
Mostly, yeah. I think also because me as a person kind of attract a certain kind of people. So the person who tends to go for someone like me versus some of the larger, more established brands, they're going to want me because of my personality and my bubbly, energetic outlook on like podcasts like this one. And because they see me everywhere and I am always there answering questions.
Okay, interesting. So you think as a result that to some extent you could say, well, it's actually a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that it's about who you are, so you're meeting those people. The reason I asked that is because one of the things that it sort of feels like to me is that if I look at the kind of cohort of people in games, I would say actually what's interesting about that is that there is like a whole generation of people in those kind of age brackets. And that's not to say there aren't people who are being terribly entrepreneurial who are much older. I would say probably not that many much younger. And I guess probably that's because, classically, you've got startup capital to set up a business. You go out, you try and build something. Most people want to do that when they've got a bit of experience. And probably when you're in your early 20s, generally, that's unlikely you're yet going to have the kind of experience to do it for most people, right?
Yeah, I did have a client last year who was just turning 17 while we were doing his Kickstarter campaign. And it was such a joy working with him. And it was even more fun when we then also discovered that there was another 17-year-old same year.
Oh, wow.
Who also came out with a game for Kickstarter. And then trying to connect those two and be like, hey, you guys are the same age and entrepreneurials in board gaming. You should be friends. And then finding out that they live like 3 towns apart. That was like the beginning of a really wonderful friendship.
Fascinating. And when you say sort of 3 towns apart, were they sort of in the Australian outback where that's like 500 miles or somewhere a little bit closer? Were they based in the US or where were
Yeah,
they?
in the US. So he was
Right,
in New York.
Oh, wow. Okay. So actually, probably, yeah, indeed, very physically got close. And that's really interesting. I mean, I always think quite surprising because one of the things that in general that I've sort of learned about founders, and as you look into the statistics of it, a lot of the kind of popular image about company founders is somewhat warped a bit by Silicon Valley, where, you know, the stories of people like Zuckerberg, who in his early 20s obviously was like creating Facebook and this sort of thing. I think it's something like the average venture capital backed startup founder is something like 45.
Yeah.
Because in reality, I mean, surprise, surprise, what a big complex business that you're going to get millions of dollars of funding for. Generally, those are experienced people who've done quite a lot of stuff and are being trusted by investors. So it isn't often that many 17-year-olds who really do that. But that's actually also really cool to hear that that's got that. I wonder partly about the 30 thing, just because it does seem to me like there's a bit of an age cohort of people who sort of seem to discover maybe games again at university. That sort of roughly fits with the timeline of having seen board games kind of go through this renaissance in general, really in the last 10 years or so, especially with the rise of Kickstarter and the kind of massive explosion of things like game cafes, which, you know, 10 years ago, there weren't really almost any of them. So I find that quite interesting. And that should be a kind of an age group to do things. You mentioned earlier, you talked about methodology, and I'm really interested in this one because, again, you also talked straight away about, okay, yeah, so things change. Naturally, there's stuff, they move on, marketing evolves, which of course immediately creates a problem because applying kind of standardized ways of doing things becomes really hard. You know, in logistics, which I've been obviously doing a lot of work on recently, there are at least some pretty good principles that you can consistently apply that remain true over time. The same thing is true, for example, for data management. I think about my former life as a software product manager. Knowing how to organize large data sets in a really efficient way was a really just important part of my job. And it actually is now as well in terms of automating a lot of what we try and do at native games. And the principles of database design basically don't change. So when you talk about methodology, can you expand on kind of what you mean and how you can possibly do anything consistently over time in this world of marketing?
That's a great question. For me, at least, it's like continuously and having routines around like relearning and like taking myself out of like what I'm doing currently, and then be like, okay, I need to test things. I need to continuously like look up what is happening and staying in touch with the market and like what we're doing as a marketer and like on social media as well. Like there is algorithm changes all the time. So you kind of always have to be open-minded to change what you're doing. You can't become rigid at any point. Obviously with Kickstarter, it's quite different because at the most I'd probably work with a campaign for 6 months. Not that much changes over such a small frame of time. And what we're starting to do is that every time I get in a new client, we look at like, what is the best way to market this one project right now to get the maximum result within the time frame that we have. And then build up a plan that kind of works for that person and that specific game with all that the game is and where the game is and like what kind of creator is it? What is the creator good at? So everyone gets sort of like a custom made puzzle piece that is sort of their marketing plan for the entire duration. But the steps on how it's created, there is a method to it. So I have a board where we go through all the different sort of like phases of like, we need to do this thing this month. And then as we're progressing, that kind of happens naturally. And I think it's really fun when I get to sort of funnel people in on the first calls and I shape that plan for them and they get to realize what they're a part of and teaching them as we go so that when I leave them after the 6 months, they know what to do, or at least in theory, they would know what to do.
That's really interesting. I mean, I can see straight away that the continuous process of learning would just be so important because if you have these shifting sands of what is working and not working, and the algorithm change is a really interesting one, right? Because in social media platform world, if Facebook decide they want to reorganize data differently, the newsfeed differently, or they're going to emphasize something else and de-emphasize something else, or Instagram, I think you and I have talked before about recent changes to the way the Instagram algorithm works to filter out what it might see as duplicate content. Suddenly means that it could dramatically affect how you're working entirely.
Oh, yeah. I sat in the middle of a campaign where we had like built up a structure of how we were supposed to do it. It just so happened that this was like the only client that I had out of the 21 that I'm currently working with, where it actually impacted our plan entirely. So we had to go sort of radio silence for a whole week to restructure what we had planned and then just like apply a new plan. That was really interesting because I didn't expect that the algorithm was going to have as much impact as it was having for like what we were doing, because we were already aware, obviously, and I've been tracking this algorithm for quite some time in terms of like when they would like properly turn it on. Just see like going from quite good reach to like tanked within like 24 hours. And I was like, what? I'm just sitting there going like, I don't understand. Like, I understand, but also like, why? What happened? And like the impact of the algorithm was just much greater than what we thought. And just sitting there and going like, okay, so what do we need to do now? Luckily, in this case, we have time to do it. It's not launching for a couple of months, but it was very interesting to just sit there on the backside and be like, oh, yeah, actually, that's a thing. And for people who are not aware of like the algorithm change, I saw someone complaining on Twitter earlier today, and I was like, yeah, I know why you're saying that. And I'm like, I could give you a long talk about this, but like, okay, so just like going into DMs, but like, actually, here's the thing, here's the link, you probably want to read this. They were like, wow, this is so helpful. And obviously, that's part of my job. I have to keep an eye on these things. And then being able to help the content creators who are obviously struggling, who are kind of reliant upon the earnings that this reach and the content that they're creating is giving them. It's an interesting position to sit in.
I mean, that's particularly, as you said, a huge problem for content creators, because effectively the social platform, particularly say YouTube, for example, is where they're making all of their money. So it's not even a question of this is a promotion platform as it would be, say, for a game publisher or a game creator who's, it might be one method by which you're accessing your market. There's also conventions, for example, you're signing up people to mailing lists. For example, you could be running ad campaigns, this kind of thing as well. That your natural organic social media reach is pretty critical there for it's drastically affecting your earnings. It's really interesting because I think a lot of people get on social media and sort of think, well, okay, what I do is I get on there and I just start shouting about what I'm doing, and then eventually profit. And that's tend to be what they tend to think. And to be honest, that's probably what I thought going into it as well, which I guess is very predictable. As these patterns, these platforms have become so dominant, and there are so many ways in which people are looking to game them or understand them, you end up in this situation where actually there's a lot more to learn about the platform than initially was obvious, right? In the same way that previously media bookings and how media advertising was managed was like through media agencies that sort of had sections that would specialize in, well, we just do TV, which was understandable because there's so much to understand just about how television works in terms of scheduling, ratings, how TV spots are bought and sold. But now effectively even what looks like the easy to use platform that encourages you to share your thoughts straight away, logs in, normally has top of the line UX for just fluidly, addictively getting you to go through content and produce it, is actually a little bit harder to use than maybe at first appears.
Yeah. While obviously the go on a platform and start shouting can give some results, it peaks quite quickly. I have a bunch of like extra accounts that I continuously run like tests on. And we found if you just go out there and shout on the biggest hashtags, at some point, it will start peaking. And usually we found that if that is your strategy to just go out there and share a post every day, usually it takes about 2 months before you peak. And that's whatever level you manage to reach there, that is what you get. So as your channel grow, you have to start applying more advanced strategies in order to continue to grow. So the more demanding, so like the bigger the account, the more demanding managing the account becomes. So it's always like, okay, how many followers do you have? At what level do we have to start with the strategies? Kind of defines it straight at the bat when someone comes to me. They're like, I need help. Okay, how many do you have? Is it 50 people or is it 1,000? Because that's hugely different what I need to do.
Interesting. So if we just drill into that a little bit more detail, because I think that will be of huge interest to listeners. Let's say you've built it up and you've got to your 1,000 level, let's say, and previously maybe you started a few years ago and you had 50 followers, I don't know, something like that. But we could talk about specific platforms here, whatever would be useful for the example. What is a good example of something where you would see a kind of shift that you would make at that level that maybe you would, there was a different strategy that you needed to get up to that level? What kind of, can you give me like a concrete example?
Okay, so at anything over like 300 followers is when you kind of have to start applying and be more mindful as to how you're using hashtags, for example. Around the 1,000 mark, you usually are more reliant upon actually sharing video content. than when you're lower end.
And this is Instagram, sorry, that we're talking about here in this context. Okay.
It's like specifically Instagram. For Twitter, it's pretty much the same over the board. It's like how many times are you interacting with people, at what times are you interacting with the people becomes the most important ones. So a lighter account should interact with people when obviously their audience is the most engaging, because visibility is a huge thing and it becomes more and more important the bigger you are. And getting the early adopters and early interactions is very important on Twitter, while as on Instagram, that is not as important. It's more the people who are seeing your content, do they interact and stop and watch it? Or do they just scroll past? The more people who scroll past your content and not finding it relevant or interesting, the less is that content is being shown to other people. Because obviously Instagram relies heavily on when you open the app, whatever you see first should be the thing that makes you prolong that session. So they want the most interesting that they think based on the algorithm. When you open the app, that should be the most interesting thing. Because otherwise you just close it because that wasn't as interesting. Maybe you'll do a whole scroll and see the first 3 posts and then close it if it wasn't that interesting. So they're reliant upon like the first 3 posts that you see in your feed is the most interesting. On TikTok, it's more like followers isn't as important, but for stories that they just launched on TikTok, that's mostly shown to your followers. And now that they have opened up for friends too, you can actually start using your followers or friends, people who are following you back, more as a way to boost your own content to get it watched more.
So that's really interesting. I mean, even just for example, talk about the differences in those platforms, I feel like it's something that people wouldn't even, or often not even really aware of, particularly at the beginning of this process. So when you said about TikTok sort of works a little bit differently, and then it may be that you said, is it followers initially are not that important? Mm-hmm. Why is that followers, for example, are not so immediately important on TikTok?
So when people are using TikTok, it's mostly so like TikTok wants you to spend hours on the app. Longer sessions is considered good. So bingeable content is important for them. As long as your content is funny or interesting, so people will watch and stay in the app longer, the more that content is going to be shown. If your content is not as interesting and people are not completing your videos, or they're not like closing the app or like leaving the app, that means that content is going to be shown less to people. And it's mining more sort of like what makes people stay rather than what are they wanting to see. It's not content that is meant to fulfill a make you happier or make you informed. It's just whatever makes you stay there. Interestingly enough, that turns out to be very often sort of like depressive content or, like light humor that isn't deep. Whatever can be shared within 7 seconds. You can't change the world in 7 seconds. So obviously there's very little informational content on TikTok. While else on Instagram, you can still do infographics and informational content.
Interesting. So I find this really fascinating because certainly what you say about TikTok is certainly from my experience of it, this thing where it's almost this constant automated loop of new and new content, just constantly. It sort of even takes the job of you having to really even scroll. It's like even lower effort than that. You just keep going. Here's more and more and more and more stuff. So that's really interesting how then it would, as you said, it's going to algorithmically push people towards the content's very engaging. It's really interesting because it makes me think about how YouTube Shorts kind of create their own 1-minute video thing. But a lot of those are like little informational clips often that are the most popular. Whereas that was certainly my impression of TikTok was going around. It was seeing not a lot of kind of, dialogue or vocal monologue type content of people talking and having like a long, not even like a 30-second inspirational clip that often, that kind of thing. I mean, well, we do know, broadly speaking, that human beings, I think, generally sense a negative emotion as weighted about 5 times a positive emotion. So that kind of means that there's this really interesting thing where it starts rewarding really unpleasant stuff. So I guess that doesn't surprise me too much. So to bring about the Instagram one again and how that's different. So you said, for example, when you got to like a large number of followers, you say 300, it was more like you started needing to share video content. And why, for example, would that be about? Why does the Instagram platform lend itself to doing that at a certain scale?
So it started obviously like the birth of Instagram was all about sharing images, and in the beginning they didn't even like you for doing editing on the images at all. So the shift that Instagram has had the last couple of years has been huge. As someone who, first only promoted like slide posts, so a picture where you can kind of go through several of them at the max of like 9, and single images, to pushing more and more video content, obviously, because TikTok is now the biggest social media platform and outwins even YouTube. I mean, it is huge. And the TikTok team is obviously not ready for this. Like, it is massive. The growth was skyrocketed very quickly. But so Instagram is trying to lean more towards what TikTok is doing, to see if they can have more of that, sort of have people create more content. And we saw some interesting shifts on like Twitter as well, with like, hey, maybe you want to do stories here too. And they were trying to kind of buy into the whole trend with TikTok to get more people create content for it, because obviously Twitter has a lot of users, but they're not doing stuff there, and they're struggling with retention rates. And on Instagram, there's a lot of people who are watching content, but not that many who's making the content. And TikTok is very specific on like, you have to make content here, and obviously everyone wants that. So Instagram has been trying to lean more to what like TikTok is doing, sharing more videos to get longer sessions, because there's only so much time you can spend on just looking at pretty pictures before you kind of need to engage your brain, or you want something else, or like a quicker release of endorphins. So obviously Reels became a thing, and then they moved it into its separate app, and they've done a lot of like small little tweaks to how this is pushed. And the Explorer page was created, which just pushes content from like random people, like we might think you think this is interesting. And looking at like how gaming section, specifically, since this is my field, we need to look at what are the biggest creators creating, like what kind of content that they're using. And the others who are in the same field kind of needs to do similar content, because that's what the algorithm thinks that we want to watch. So that's what gets pushed. It's an interesting sort of synergy, but like the biggest content creator creates this kind of content, we need to also create similar type of content, because that's going to make us being discoverable, and it's going to create the reach that we're wanting from the platform. And if we don't, we're kind of shooting yourself in your own foot here. So you have to adapt with what the community is wanting, and also like what is the community making in terms of content.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a tremendous amount to mine there, isn't there? I mean, just thinking about looking at all those other creators and just trying to think what would be popular. No wonder that very rapidly turns into a full-time job.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so given this kind of like we've just spent a little bit of time there talking about one specific part of the broader marketing picture for a Kickstarter campaign. And we could have gone on probably for hours talking about just the nuances of the different social media platforms. So given that, I'd like to kind of just back us up a step again to how you work with your clients. So when you talk about, for example, okay, we're going to do a plan. You've got this one kind of small saving grace to this, which is that generally you're working on a campaign by campaign basis. So at least you're not going to have to overhaul the entire marketing strategy for this business many times over. It's it's a more of a one and done thing. Hopefully, unless there's a major algorithm change, it's going to be like on social media. It should be a fairly stable environment, at least for the period of the campaign, and build up to get there. So you said, right, okay, you do a kind of kickoff with the client. It would be great if we could go into a little more detail. I'd love to understand a bit more about exactly how that works. So what are the questions you're asking them? What are the really key things you need to know from them? And what do they need to know from you?
Okay. The first thing I do is I invite them so I use a lot of Trello. I think that's a great tool just because it's kind of low threshold for participation. I think it's quite easy to explain how it works. It doesn't look too intimidating. You can have firework bursts when things are done, which people seem to really love.
Oh, I've seen that feature. Yeah, people love that. And don't the cards, if they've been around a long time on Trello, they sort of decay, don't they? They like fray around the edges like bits of paper.
Oh, I don't have that one.
Oh, that's certainly a feature they used to use. Maybe that's because you're doing things so quickly. You're not have time for the Trello boards for the cards to decay. I don't know. Maybe they got rid of that feature because it's just too depressing for people. I'm not sure, but certainly I remember you certainly used to do that.
Well, there's a lot of extra animations you can add to it. I just did the firework because it makes people happy.
Why not? It's charming.
Yeah. So what we will usually do is that the first things I will ask is, obviously, when is your launch? What is your plan? And it would be anything from 6 months to maybe a month from when they're talking to me. And what I do is very different from depending on where in the stage. So I'll reshuffle the board based on that. Because there's things that we are like non-negotiables that have to happen. Like I always encourage everyone to register their game to obviously like BGG, which they don't always have. There are content creators that will refuse to touch your game if you're not on BGG with it. So that's obviously really important. Noting your launch on like Shelf Clutter, I think is super important because it's a discovery platform basically at this point.
So shelf clutter? I'm not familiar with this at all.
It's a Discord channel. The content creators are called Shelf Clutter. Once a week on Sundays, they create a video on upcoming Kickstarters. They basically give a little bit of a review. They have their preview page so they can see on like the backside before launch. So they know your funding goals and what the page is looking like. And they'll spend somewhere between a minute, maybe 3 minutes talking about your campaign.
So I can see why that's super important, right? You want to make it into their roundups, I assume.
Absolutely. And there's not that many creators who do the roundups. I think I know of like 3 or 4 that are like good enough that I would consider it important to list it and like engage them for that part. So that is something that we always have to do. And for that to happen, it has to be at least 1 week prior. But if you want to optimize on that, the earlier, the better, because they create a separate channel for your game inside their Discord channel. So you can kind of start talking about your game. You can share pictures. You can engage extra audience. You can funnel people into this Discord and you can use it as a part of your reach campaign for discovery, which I think is fantastic when we get to do that. And then there's like the routine questions, which is which pledge manager are you planning on using? Is it Backergate, GameFound, the pledge manager? Where are you manufacturing? Who are you manufacturing with? You'd be surprised on the amount of time people are like, oh, I don't know yet. Who would you recommend? So I have a list of people with like, here are the names and emails of people you should reach out because I know that they'll take good care of you. Same thing for fulfillment. I have a list of fulfillment companies that will be, good to work with depending on where they are and the scope of their project. We always recommend to work with 1 to 3 different fulfillment companies, and there'll be contact information on there as well for those if they haven't ventured into it yet. And then we kind of get into like the framework task, because then when we know where the game is coming from and how that fulfillment part is going to look like, and like the post campaign, is it going to a website afterwards? Is it going to retail? Because that's going to also define like what is the marketing plan.
Right. I mean, that makes total sense. I mean, so what's so interesting is there straight away you're in a situation where you're actually recommending stuff that goes way beyond just the marketing element of this, I guess. So things like, I guess, is this because you have a lot of new creators, but almost by definition, like Kickstarter is in its original intention, it might be being used by some companies as a bit of a pre-order platform now. But realistic, but right, its intention was to start completely new things off, which is obviously going to skew towards completely new companies. I'm sure probably the modal average number of campaigns that a typical creator has is presumably 1, because it's their first thing. And then there are a small number of people who have done a few, and then a very small number of people who've done loads. So yeah, so it's interesting that you have to kind of help them often a little bit with the manufacturing. How are you going to manufacture? How are you going to fulfill? Those are logistics questions and production questions that really are not really related to the marketing, although I can see that things like your channels that you're going to sell through in after the campaign, I imagine that would be pretty important, getting those right.
Yeah, so it has to do about positioning basically for me as to why I'm doing this, because if they're just working with one fulfillment company and it's going to be best for, say, North America, which is, if they're choosing one, that's usually the one that they're going for. At what point I need to be, using American English, I need to primarily focus on US hashtags. If we're diving into hashtag strategy, there's so many like small things that actually shapes it that most people wouldn't think about, that actually matters. Because as soon as I join a project with an IP here in Finland and I start doing things on socials, that geolocation matters. I tend to drag with me like 30% or up to 30% of like their entire campaign. from like Europe interest, just because I'm here.
Oh, hang on a minute. So when you talk about the geolocation, do you mean, are we talking about in the sense of your natural network of people you're associated with? Or are you talking about literally algorithm stuff to do with where it's detecting your location?
Algorithm.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, literally the algorithm. Yeah.
So are you using do you use a VPN or something like that for that then? To make sure that
Yeah. We've done a lot of tests with using VPNs during campaigns to like post during it, but because it uses the location for your phone rather than the service, it doesn't really matter. So we had another one that I was working with to sort of do it for socials that was in the Philippines, and we were seeing like 40% reach for Philippines, but they were not a targeted audience at all, and they were obviously not interested in what we were selling. But because she was there, we kind of had to get our US SIM card because the VPN just didn't do anything for us.
Oh, wow. So almost then would it make sense then to deliberately try and, I guess there's a limit to what you can do with some of the platforms, but with a lot of the platforms, deliberately just use your desktop to manage them and then VPN the desktop. Is that something you can do?
Yeah.
God, that's really interesting to think about, right? That's one of those slightly weird, again, effects about all of this because of the increasing dominance of social platforms that you wouldn't even have considered as being an issue. That not because obviously if you don't have, let's say, media and creators who are located in a location, well, obviously no one knows about you in that country, so of course you're not going to get traction there. That makes sense. So to make sure I've really got this clear, she was social posting from her phone or posting from her phone in the Philippines, and as a result, algorithms were deciding, oh well, let's show this to content of people in the Philippines, and actually it was maybe a game marketed more Americans and it wasn't going to them.
Absolutely. So that's
mind-blowing. That's really interesting. That surprised me quite a bit, actually, to think that is now going to be an increasing issue to think about with these kind of campaigns.
Yeah. So I actually have people working for my company that are in the US. So in the cases where we have, like only US fulfillment, which is very rare. I mean, if they come to me being in Finland, usually I can talk them into doing EU too, and the whole, EU friendly and UK friendly shipping, because that's the kind of scope of campaign that they want. So in the rare cases where that's not possible, because of the scope of the project, I use one of the people that sits in the US, and they will do all the social. So I will schedule the things, but in terms of all the engagement, that has to be handled for someone who is in the US.
That's really interesting. That's absolutely extraordinary that should now be such an element to keep in mind of the whole thing. So, okay, so bring it to this framework and talking a bit about the marketing side of it. So let's assume they've got the manufacturer in place, they've got fulfillment, and you've worked out what the posting looked like. Maybe it's, let's say for argument's sake, they're going to run an e-commerce site and they're going to have maybe their own Shopify and they're going to be selling continually is the goal on that. And hopefully they're going to sell like 1 million copies a day. And, that's what they hope anyway. But bringing it back to the more realistic present, let's say that's broadly what's the setup. What's next? How are you going to help them decide what their marketing strategy is? What's the next thing to look at?
Okay, so I would go through with the client, like, what are the influencers that we'll be working with? Where are they located? And what is the most optimal way of sending out prototypes? And also we would be looking at like the demographic of said influencers, because that matters too, obviously. And also like, what sort of network do they have? I tend to shy away from content creators who are participating in what we essentially call a pod, which is a group of content creators that are kind of promising each other to comment on each other's post for extra reach. And while that was a huge thing last year, it's essentially like a death blow at this point, because the algorithm has shifted in order for that not to be beneficial anymore, because it's creating artificial sort of inflating the content, and then Instagram goes no and kind of just slaps a paw on top of it and goes like this but no more. So when
so they're detecting where there's like unusual amount of activity of interrelation between multiple creators, who are all obviously trying to boost each other a bit, because obviously if they all signal boost each other, then that's great, except that since you could try and game the system that way, they're actively trying to detect that now and then downrank it. Yeah.
So when they're coming in from links, or if they're going in through search specifically, that's when that will happen. But if they're going in through their feed, which means quite a lot of scrolling sometimes, then it's okay. So you have to be like super smart on how you're doing it. If they're participating in pods, usually this doesn't happen because content creators will think of immediate sort of return rather than the long-term strategy. And obviously, I need to think about the long-term strategy for the company, especially if we're going into e-commerce and all that. While it would be lovely to be able to, hand over an account that has like 200 new followers every month and all that, that looks fantastic. But in the long term, that doesn't tend to sustain itself unless you have interesting content and you're getting the early adopters from actually authentic reach rather than inflated artificially.
Okay, so this is so the next question is then, is this key selection of content creators seems really important. What are you looking for in a content creator to match a campaign, and how would you match those things together?
So I obviously chat with a lot of content creators like daily. I have a list of somewhere in the ballpark of 300-400 of like content creators that I love working with. And whenever possible, I will ask them like, what is your favorite type of game? If I were to pitch you like your favorite type and like combinations of mechanics, and then they'll tell me like, oh, I really love, say, worker placement, or I love miniatures, and then I'll note it down in my spreadsheet. And whenever I have something that matches those criteria, I'll be like, hey, I have a game for you. You mentioned that you really love this thing. What do you think about this? So I tend to have a sort of like 90% on my pitches. That is like an immediate, yes, I'm super enthusiastic about whatever it was. And I think that's awesome. So whenever someone comes in and be like, oh yeah, this game has hand management. And I was like, oh, I have the perfect person for you.
Right. Yeah, I see. That makes total sense. That's really interesting. And then so after you've got that list, then what's next?
Okay, so let's see. We talked about the frameworks. We have the influencers. I have looked through their folders of like what is the assets that I'm working with. I'll have a meeting with my graphic designer of like, what do we need to make? How is the social going to look? For some campaigns, that means that we're doing essentially what is called a beauty grid, which means that everything is laid out in a particular way, and we will stick to the beautiful visual layout of the game throughout the feed. So when someone visits, it's like a continuous journey that kind of emulates how the Kickstarter page is going to look. And we're kind of essentially giving them the Kickstarter experience from the very beginning, from the first post. And other times it's more chaotic, or there will be some like overarching plans of what it's going to look like, but there's more flexibility. Less rigid, and maybe like will be quicker to respond to trends because some games require that, and in that case you can't really do like super thought out planned grid. So it's really about like matching it to like what is the finished sort of result of like the Kickstarter page, so that people feel that they've seen it before and they know this feeling, like creating that attachment almost to the game and the way of talking, so that they are more likely to end up pledging, and you're warming them up as you're going into the pre-launch.
And how do you make sure that, when you say beauty grid, this isn't just the kind of grid on Instagram where you see like the 3x3 images. This is a more broader concept than that in terms of
That's a whole thing. So it will be like the 3x3s kind of blends into the next 3x3s, and you can have like the same background going out through the whole thing. Or it can be a collection of series of 3x3s that have sort of the same visual feel to it, but maybe there's different elements happening. We had a really cool one where there was a lot of characters and a lot of art, and each page would represent a separate piece of art, but it would be like each 3x3s would be sections of the game. So saying if you have like an apples to apple kind of game, one would be like the questions, and then the other one would be answers. And then for each of the 3x3s, you swap between the two. So sort of deliver the whole experience.
Right, interesting. Okay, cool. So that's very interesting. And then outside of that Instagram, or if we're talking more about how this would apply to something YouTube or another place like BGG, let's say, how do you approach things there?
Yeah. So one of the first week tasks that I do is that I do a full review and sort of an audit of their BGG page and like socials and websites, where I'll create like an actionable list of things that we need to fix that are like critical and things that we need to work on during the campaign, like the pre-launch. So that when we're launching and people are checking it, they'll be like, oh yeah, this looks legit, like this looks good. Or at least it's not being like any red flags, be like, oh, they're not even active. There's no forum post. Like, why is there? We need that to happen. So it's making sure like the best pictures are showing, that they're tagged correctly, that there's a link to the publisher artist is registered, that the companies and all the people who are engaged has their page in there with information and beautiful pictures. And if not, set them up with like, you need to take this picture, you need to have this done. All of those sort of small things that people tend to forget.
And then if they fix all these sort of different smaller issues and then things are kind of in good shape. Let's say if we take a campaign, because I can imagine there must be a limit, where if it's a month out, for example, I'm guessing primarily people come to you and said, hey, I'm launching my Kickstarter in a month's time and I would like to raise $1 million, which is my funding goal. There's like a limit to how much. First time I actually tell them, you might want to bring your funding goal down a little bit. But also there's like a limit to how much you can do other than just make sure the campaign's in the best shape it can be, do some of that really important due diligence about organizing your websites correctly in advance. But if you've got a longer period of time and it's like a 6-month build up to something, what does that look like?
That means that we would start as soon as possible. So all the small things are done, usually within the first 3 weeks. Then we start lead generation campaigns. So I have a separate ads manager that handles these things for my campaigns. So I don't have to, because I'll be busy in meetings.
You're right, yes. I mean, God, there's the thing about, I used to work in advertising, and there's so many different levers you can pull and things you can do with an ad campaign.
It really is.
I worked on the technology side, really heading up the product development. But when I used to see the traders, as we used to call them, who were traders because they were effectively buying media at one price and selling it for another, with the layer of all the targeting and media creative, which we put on top of it, which is kind of value added. It seemed to be that they were a kind of strange mixture of scientists and wizards.
It is, isn't it? The fun thing is that most of that hard work is done during the first 3 weeks of me defining the campaign with the client and also looking at what the skills to the client is. So say we have a client who's really good at graphic design, for example, we can use that. And there's a particular way that we can use that as a part of the targeting, because that kind of sets expectation as to what can we expect from the client to give us, or how much do we need to sort of make happen.
That's interesting, isn't it? And it's interesting to talk about that's being set and a lot that's been discovered in the first 3 weeks. And we're talking the first 3 weeks of this 6-month build-up, right?
Yeah.
And then the lead generation campaigns, can you tell me a bit more about those? Because I think, for example, when we did Magnate and we were doing Kickstarter for that, I think I built our mailing list the old-fashioned way. We went to loads of conventions and we just signed up everyone. Most of that mailing list was people who'd played the game at conventions, which meant it was a really high quality mailing list, really, really high quality. But obviously we did a little bit of ad lead generation ad campaign, but I don't think we added that many that way. I don't know if we had a particularly good lead generation campaign, to be completely honest. It's difficult to say at this point. But yeah, I'd like to know a little bit more about the kind of the goals of that and what kind of outcomes you're looking for.
Yeah, we usually estimate a budget of like 500 USDs for the first month of lead generations, because there's a lot of things that we need to test in terms of optimizing the return of those leads. We tend to land somewhere, below $2 per acquisition, like per email. And as down, I think the lowest we've ever had was like 0.2 for an email, which is obviously
20
amazing.
cents an email?
Yeah.
20 cents an email? Oh, and okay, to ask the question, immediate follow-up question. If you're getting even $2 sounds very reasonable to me.
Yeah.
How are those then? What's the conversion rate look like for that on the campaign itself?
We tend to have somewhere between 17 to, I think the highest one I've ever had was 55% conversion for those
Sorry,
emails.
You've got to stop a second there. Sorry, let me really make sure I understand this correctly. You were getting 65% conversion from those emails that had been acquired through the lead generation campaign?
Yes. That was the best one, obviously. I think that was in the alien of them. I'm not sure if I can replicate that. I'd love to, obviously.
Right, yeah, that would be I think anyone would love to replicate that rate. What would be a more typical rate that you would be, for example, a more average expectation? Because I think an important thing for people to know if they're listening to this and they're thinking about, oh, I want to run a lead generation campaign, is that they don't go away thinking you're going to pay 20 cents for an email and get a 65% conversion rate guaranteed. Because I feel like that would be not a reasonable expectation. Can you give me some more typical ideas? Because obviously you can't talk about specific clients, but I'd be really interested to know about what the general trends you're seeing are.
Yeah, so overall, I've done 40 campaigns now so far in my career of doing Kickstarter.
40
campaigns.
40.
Yes.
And how and just so I think again, this would also be good for people to understand your workload. What is the what is the how many is that over running campaigns?
Over 20. All but 5.
Oh, sorry. No, I mean, like you've run 40 campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
How much time is that within? Is that the last 3 years, last 2 years?
That time. Okay, I thought like over 20 in terms of like the funding. But
right, how long the campaign runs for in terms of number of days, right? No, I was thinking about how much, just to get a sense of like how many different campaigns you're working on at the time period, because obviously Kickstarter hasn't existed for the almost 20 years you've been working in this space.
Definitely not.
So, if it was over 20 years, that would be still, to me, having run one, that would still be a good amount. But how many years are we talking about here?
Okay, so my first campaign was with Green Meadow Games, which was like last year, which is like full time.
Okay.
But I really started 2 years ago, February 2 years ago.
Right. So basically, that's about 20 campaigns a year. That is all my Kickstarter campaigns. So over that,
I've already done 20 this year, so
it's going to be a lot more. Okay, so given that, what kind of so for those campaigns that all happened quite recently, so this is actually quite good as well, because you're not talking even about Kickstarter stretching back to like 2016 when things on Kickstarter seemed pretty different, right? Like what was working then is almost certainly not working now.
This is essentially the start of the pandemic. So
that's really interesting. So that's really interesting for the perspective of that itself is going to be a slightly changed environment compared to previous environment. I mean, even with Magnate, we were running that literally just before the pandemic started. So was when our founding campaign, I think we finished on the 23rd or 21st of December 2019. So really, really close. That seems highly pertinent for at least where we are right now. What are those kind of average statistics in terms of conversion that you're looking at?
Somewhere between, so we kind of benchmark at we say 10, but we tend to be more in the 17 to 45.
So it's quite a big fluctuation within that. But I think I could see where you would give it 10. So if say, let's say, for argument's sake, let's take the low end of that and say what's often, you absolutely can't promise this, but what's often being achieved is around 20, let's say, then 20%, and I'm going to take the upper end of your estimate from before, if you think that's okay, and say $2 a sign up, maybe rather than 20 cents, because that seems like very, very good.
Yes.
So for $2 a sign up, you've got 20% of those are converting. If your average, let's say what would be a typical pledge level? Is that $50? We use that. I guess that makes the maths easy.
59, but yeah, say 50.
59. Oh, that tends to be the average, right? Okay, yeah. So instead of $59, so that means of that, so 10% would be $5.90. So you're looking at $11.80. No, hang on. I'm going to completely embarrass myself by getting this maths wrong. I can just tell right now. But if your 20% of that is converting, even from that list, and each time they convert, then effectively you've paid $10 for a conversion, because it's only 20% of them that are converting, but you're only paying $2 a shot. That seems like an incredible rate of return for that.
Yeah, I think it's quite fair.
I find this quite surprising. I think that's really fascinating, because it strikes me that then, like, the difference between a well-run and a not well-run example of this is quite substantial, because certainly our experience running advertising was we had some channels that were really good for us. So I think for Magnate, VGG was actually a pretty good channel for Magnate, but we had some channels that were just total stinkers. And to be honest, Facebook, for example, we were getting nowhere near that kind of rate of return on Facebook. So that's very interesting. But crucially, these are these lead generation campaigns where you're running them sometimes months in advance then potentially of the actual campaign launch.
Yeah, we are. Absolutely. As soon as we can, really, like we go through the ads, like all the assets, and we start creating ads as early as we can, because it is quite crucial, because you kind of need. So a lot of people in marketing say that when you bring 6 people to Kickstarter yourself from your own mailing list, Kickstarter will give you 4. That's kind of the golden rule that I see a lot of people throw out. But I don't want to promise anyone that. Like, I can't promise that we are going to be able to work the algorithm. Sometimes Kickstarter just doesn't like your campaign. And while most of my campaign do get the Project You Love tag, and we are able to sit within the top 10 for our category for like the first week, that doesn't always happen. And I always like to plan for like the worst outcome, as in Kickstarter, the algorithm doesn't work. So say we're taking away those 4 people. That means that the mailing list that we're creating has to be enough for us to still be able to fund within the first day, or at least the first 3 days, which is, that's kind of when it has to happen. If you're going to have any sort of extra reach from Kickstarter, that's kind of the benchmark. Within the first 3 days, you need to be able to fund. And I always aim towards the shorter side of things. Like, I want you to be able to fund within the first day. And that's where we work, which means that when someone coming to me with a campaign and they're like, we want 20K. And I'm like, okay, what is your funding goal? They give me a number, we start doing the math, and I times that with 10 for how many we need on the mailing list for the minimum required of backers pledging at the smallest level possible. And I said, that's our goal in terms of like, how many emails do we need? So that's usually, somewhere between 2,000 to maybe 3,000-4,000 people, because we want to be able to secure that funded within the first day.
Yeah, I mean, that makes total sense. I mean, that's what I'm increasingly seeing, that the difference between the quality of outcomes between funding the first day and not seems to be pretty substantial. That was certainly something on my list, even in 2019, was seemed absolutely critical to succeed in that as rapidly as possible to get that funded without it just being something silly. Someone sent me something recently where he said, he was telling me, someone messaged us and saying they'd funded in the first 5 minutes, and they were something like, they said, my campaign was 11,000% funded. And then I looked and the funding goal was $10. And I was like, well, okay. So hang on a second. Like, no, that's, I feel like I get it, right? But I feel like that's just not, if you actually see those numbers, you go, yeah, that's not real, mate. That's just, you've just literally fixed it artificially low to make that number happen. Come on.
A lot of the campaigns that I end up running with first timers, we aim at funding with a 30% subsidized funding goal. That means that the creators are able to cover 30%, even if as long as we're hitting the funded, and then they can go in with about 30% of the funding goal themselves to kind of be like the actual funding goal. Because obviously a lower funding goal, it looks good, and being able to hit that as early as possible is obviously beneficial. But most of the campaigns that I end up pairing with is with people who just want the game out. They want to realize the dream of having someone play their game. It's not I want to get rich on this, like I want to recover all my costs, or I want to be on green within the first campaign. For most people, that never really happens. And going in with about a 30% subsidized for like how much it costs you to actually create the game in terms of like art and your time and the prototypes and the influencers and all like paying me, obviously kind of 30% are reasonable expectations. And it's just kind of worked for us, as I make sure that they are able to meet with that. And if not, obviously we're working with a higher goal, which means that we just have to get more leads in earlier.
Makes sense. I mean, I think this is kind of one of the open secrets about Kickstarter, if one has ever had time to properly delve into it, seems to be precisely this, which is, in reality, the funding goal isn't so much the actual amount that you really need, and that if you don't get a penny less, that's it. it's actually often it's often a big chunk towards it. And normally, so it was for me, the kind of chunk that's the difference between being able to do it or not. But actually what it doesn't mean is that really it's funded it completely, because if you do that, I have seen several campaigns, including one I saw that was from a quite experienced creator, but they still set their funding goal, I felt, to like just a bit above the truly economic cost of production. And what was interesting to see was that the campaign just crawled all the way there, because actually to get there, there was no way it was funding in the first 24 hours. And of course, because it didn't fund in the first 24 hours, it didn't have the momentum to fund even more than that. So it's sort of interesting to see those economics. And I've always thought of that funding goal as almost like a bit of a bet, in the sense that it's like, okay, this is like the level I'm setting is like my reserve price at an auction. This is the level I will walk away and be happy with. And I got to eat it up if it only gets that level. But I need to get that level as low as I can tolerate without setting it to a level that frankly looks fraudulent, where people just have a funding goal, which is like a non-real funding goal.
Yeah. If your funding goal doesn't look like kind of realistic from someone who isn't in the industry, because you can kind of guess, right? A 20K campaign, you're kind of expecting a certain level of something for that funding goal. Like the audience is expecting something. So for me, obviously, with what I do is that when we're talking about the funding goal and all the stretch goals and all of the kind of things that comes into your Kickstarter, is what is the audience going to expect from the funding goal that you're making? So whenever we're having a funding goal that is like, this is the game, and we're able to do like no fluff campaigns, meaning no extra stretch goals or like elaborate promises, usually those tend to have a under 20K campaign sort of as a funding goal. And the ones that has more elaborate stretch goal tends to be the ones who needs to get over the 20K mark.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that makes total sense. I mean, there's different production situations. I'm really aware that we are starting to run quite short of time, and I feel like we're only just scratching the surface of all of these topics. But there's a few things I want to make sure that we can cover, because I think they'd be kind of really useful for listeners. So the first one I want to ask is really kind of what your top 3 pieces of advice of things maybe we've not covered yet would be for running a campaign. Because I imagine there's loads of people out there thinking, I've got a game. I mean, something that I noticed actually specifically is that it felt like 10 years ago and 10 or 15 years ago, everyone had like a screenplay or a novel they had written. Like, oh, I'm actually working on a screenplay. I'm working on a novel. These days, I meet people randomly in bars, like meeting new people at parties, and they say, I've actually designed a board game. And that's actually quite a common thing now, which is, I mean, really cool that that's the case. But it does mean you've got a lot of people out there don't have the experience, looking for, okay, how do I go about running maybe even a really small Kickstarter campaign, maybe just a few $1,000 funding goal, simple card game, something like that. Or maybe it's a hugely ambitious $1 million miniatures project. I don't know. Either way, they're going to have the same fundamental problem, which is that they don't necessarily know what the key things to do are. What would you say the top 3 things they need to do are?
Okay. There's one thing that I tell everyone. I think every single podcast I go on, I say the same thing, which is there's no such thing as too early to start talking about your game. There is only really too late. And I think that if anyone was ever to quote me on anything, I think I want people to quote me on that one, because it is so true when it comes to harvest, like, what was it? Someone was saying, like, talk to Dina to harvest the potential of social media. And I was like, I was looking at it going like, like the really core thing here is just start early, because that is all, you just got to start. And I know that a lot of people find the threshold to participate really high sometimes, and they doubt themselves in their ability to actually participate, and just like do it, right? It's kind of like you just got to jump into it and then try. And obviously my website has a lot of like starting tips for like how to just get started with like Twitter 101, or the social media algorithm kind of breaks down of like super simple so that everyone can kind of understand it. Because I think lowering the level for participation is kind of the most important thing us as marketers can do when it comes to like social media.
And what was that website again? Just people to check out. Just
marketingwithdina.com.
Marketingwithdina.com. Okay, great. So if anyone needs to look up anything about that kind of thing, you've got some helpful tips there. I think that's just super useful, just to start with. So that was my experience. I remember reading in one of sort of Jamie Stegmaier's legendary blog post series about starting a Kickstarter. He was like, I recommend you at least 6 months, or really more like a year if you can, And I remember hearing that thinking, all right, okay. And I think at this point, it must have been early 2018. And I was like, right, let's get started. We're going to start the campaign trail. And I think in the end, we had like 18-month build up to it.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Well, it was great. It meant that we had this game that, to be honest, bit of a nightmare first time project in some ways, because it's this, well, I right now, obviously listeners can't see this, but right behind you, I can actually see a copy of Magnate. And it is absolutely... and his vast, dominating presence there on that shelf. This big box game, and he's full of miniatures. And actually, a lot of people said in the campaign later, they said, look, I would have considered backing this, but I just wasn't going to do miniatures, back a first-time company doing miniatures. I can totally get that. I totally think that's quite reasonable, actually, to think maybe I'm not going to dive straight in with that. So, yeah, so that's kind of, I think that's very useful to understand. What would your other kind of top tips be? If that's like the number one supreme thing is like, it's never too early, it's only too late. What would be your other two key pieces of advice?
A friend of mine, Joe Slack, has written some really great book about crowdfunding for games specifically. And I think if anyone likes to read rather than like listen to podcasts for learning how to do these things, I think his books are really good. And he even has like a course where you can kind of go to him and be like, hi, Joe, teach me everything you know about like fulfillment and manufacturing and like everything that kind of expected from you on like the product side prior to going into a launch and before you even get someone like me on board for doing the marketing. And I think the third tips that would be like find people that you like and that matches your energy level and that you can work with, that kind of fits your personality and like also fits your game and understands it. Because I think that's so important. And like in terms of building a team, have people who believe in your game, not just doing it for the money, but who can actually be a part of like, not your hype group, because I don't believe in having team members who are a part of your hype. I don't think that's appropriate, but someone who can be more like a pep team for you as a creator to continue working towards having a launch.
Yeah, I mean, that seems really important. Something I would say is true of sort of businesses in general is that having someone that is always on your team, and even if that's just someone who's just a really supportive friend who can kind of help out, but particularly useful if they actually know a lot about the business, is huge. Because there are always going to be bits where you get depressed or you hear some bad news. I remember the day I started seeing the kind of freight pricing we were going to pay for Magnate. We had estimated it one number from 2019, and we had a number that was 7 to 8 times higher. And I remember just being like the gut punch of like, oh, we that's fine. We just have 27 pallets stacked high of games to move. Having some people around me at that time to be supportive and to get through that was very important to us.
Yeah, having buddies, basically, like find people in the space that are experiencing the same things. What I like to do with people that I'm working with is finding them launch buddies, which is something we're working on, like actually putting up like a program in the board gaming space. So that might be coming later this year, we're hoping, where we're basically like team you up with other creators that aren't just my clients, because right now it's just like everyone I work with who are launching at the same time becomes launch buddies. And then we kind of have them meet and chat a little bit with each other. But we want to like make it for other people as well, because the power of just having someone who's going through the same thing at the same time with you in terms of like frustrations over Kickstarter and like page layout, it's just, that is so important. And like the mental health of the people who go through that with someone else, you come out of the project a lot sort of healthier than those who don't have that kind of support.
Yeah, so starting early, keeping, having buddies around and support. And what do you think the other big one would be, do you think?
Like read up on things. Don't go in blind.
Read up, educating yourself.
There's never too late for school.
It's never too late for school. I like that. Yeah, I certainly think I remember thinking that this was pretty critical, and seeing, and actually the cool thing is that I think particularly between James Marler's stuff and Jamie Stegmaier's stuff, there was actually already quite a lot online of good resources. But I guess they've also got your website to check out now too. But some nice summaries, no doubt. Because the one thing I will say about Jamie Stegmaier's post is that you should set yourself up for a long read. I feel like he did so
Grab
many.
a coffee and like that takes your day.
I think I installed a special plugin, I remember, on my Chrome that did like a bulk upload of all of the blog posts to a reader. just so that I could carry them around and read them on my phone when I was like sitting in the tube and stuff like that several years ago.
That is such a good advice.
And I just thought, because he has got a special page on his website where he organizes them all by different themes as well. And you start scrolling through and just like, oh, I'm still scrolling. And it's great because he even got into details about US tax, which turned out to be really important for us because we decided to end up incorporating a company in Wyoming, which is a subsidiary of Naylor Games Limited. So already that international for that, and it was very helpful reading some of the material about US tax treatments of things that, as a British person, I wouldn't necessarily have any inherent knowledge of that I needed to look up. So that's really great. Well, I think all of that is going to be super, super useful. Like I said, God, there was so much on my list that we didn't even remotely get round to. So if you would like to do so, it would be brilliant to have you back as a guest again. And thank you so much for speaking to me.
I mean, thank you for having me.
Producing Fun is produced by Naylor Games. If you enjoyed the show, follow us on Spotify, Stitcher, or other major podcasting platforms. Remember, Producing Fun is also a product, and it thrives on feedback. So please leave a review wherever possible, or simply send me your feedback directly. You can message me on Twitter @NaylorJames, or write me an email, james@naylorgames.com. Until next time.